Restoring the Culture is hosted by Tanya Taylor, Rubins Steam Story mentor, and Camille Adair, family constellation facilitator. In this podcast, these long-term friends explore how stories serve our lives. Their inquiry meanders into the realms of science, theater, health, and consciousness, moving the individual and global narratives forward as they draw upon their relationship as the laboratory for their experiments in truth. So many of us feel isolated and alone in our deepest longings. Each one of us is necessary in rediscovering the truth of our human story and listening to what is calling us forward so that we can restore the culture together.
Hey everybody, this is Tanya. Welcome back to another episode of Restoring the Culture with myself and my dear friend Camille. I want to start today with a quote. "The world needs your rebellion and the true song of your exile. In what has been banned from your life, you find medicine to heal all that has been kept from our world." And that is by the author Toko Ukraina Turner. So Camille and I decided we have all kinds of interesting and provocative conversations offline all the time, as we're dear friends. And we've decided that we're going to shake things up a little bit and make the conversations even more improvisational sometimes, as if we're just on the phone and you're listening in to one of our private conversations. And to do this, we've decided sometimes to simply surprise each other with topics and invite each other into an inquiry. So that's what we're doing today. So Camille doesn't know the topic for today. I'm just going to bring it up and why I'm inspired to bring it up. And what I want to call it is the danger of viewing the world through a single narrative, and particularly in crisis. So Camille, thanks for joining me and jumping in for this topic. I want to give you a little bit about just what's been going through my head about this in the last few days. We're still in the middle of this pandemic, and I think it's going to be interesting to look back historically on our podcast in the midst of this pandemic and see, as a cultural, almost pop culture lens, right? And the way the world's changing each week and our commentary on it. So I'm watching things online in different cohorts I'm part of, different groups of people. Like you, I'm a bridge person. I cross into a lot of different worlds online, particularly on social media. I'm friends with people globally from very different backgrounds and from very, very different contexts. I've got a lot of friends who are, strongly in a social justice world, people in the States, Europe, Australia, in a business cohort I'm part of, friends from Santa Fe, from Nashville, different parts of the U.S. too, and alternative communities, Santa Fe, sort of counterculture vibe. And it's very disturbing right now to see the polarization and of people with each other. And certainly I've been polarized with others at times in my life, viewing the world through my own lens, my own bias. And now as this crisis escalates, right? And it's not only the coronavirus crisis, it's the political crisis, it's the rise of fascism globally. There's a lot of stuff around racism and class. There's a lot of fear in individuals. How can I protect me, mine? Conspiracy theories, some may say, and someone else may say legitimate concerns about government, big pharma. But the polarization is painful. And as I'm hearing people speak, listening to the way things are around face masks, for example, right now, to wear or not to wear, considerations around racial considerations. Like if you're a white person, you have this privilege, you have, or certain kinds of privilege we can carry, unconscious privilege and bias, having money right now. Some people are in food lines all over the country, food banks, socioeconomic privilege. It's really influencing how people think. I'm seeing some people I've really respected in the past professionals go into deep fear. A lot of new agey sort of conspiracy theories running rampant. So once again, what this all brings me to is, and I don't want to come so much from my own bias or even so much from my opinion, as speak from sort of the center of all of these narratives, right? Because and how do we shift? This part of the inquiry I wanted to bring to you is to get your thoughts on, because I feel pretty stumped right now. I know I need to speak through the lens of different narratives and share more of my own experiences, but what are your thoughts on navigating the polarities right now and the presumptions and the way to minimize harm? Because a lot of harm is happening emotionally, and I know harm always comes out of polarization when we stop talking to each other or talking to each other without it being hateful or condescending, mean-spirited, and at the same time not shutting down the very real voices of people who are bringing up dissonance. Like it says, this is why I brought in this quote, the world needs your rebellion and the true song of your exile. And to be listening to people who are different from us, and to be listening to people who've been exiled culturally, who don't have such dominant voices, or have been more marginalized for whatever reasons. So that's a mouthful, right? I know that I just said it's a lot, but I'm thinking about the single narrative, and when we're in our own little microcosm and we're not able to extend and see other narratives and take these points of view in consideration, it just feels even more painful to me. It almost feels like we're doing violence on each other on top of the violence that's happening in the world.
Well, there are so many things that come up for me. I think the first thing, and I'll just share with one of the things that I've been doing in these times to support myself in staying connected. But first I'd like to speak to sort of this idea of one narrative, which is very, in terms of, the work that Ian McGilchrist and others have done on the right and left hemispheres of the brain. It's very left hemisphere to want to have an answer. It makes the left hemisphere of the brain feel safer because that's the competitive, language-oriented side of the brain. And that's not the side of the brain that's relational. So what I've been doing, because I live in a community and have a family, and I've actually noticed even the differences between the generations. Mm-hmm. So I'm around people who have varying degrees of fear and different thinking around how to be with the virus and how to be with other people with the virus. Mm-hmm. And I kind of got to this place where I was like, I'm kind of sick of hearing what people think. Like, depending on what news you're exposed to or what articles you're reading, it's like, and that's a way we're feeding the left hemisphere of the brain, right? We're just feeding ourselves all this information.
Right.
And there are a million different ways to synthesize that and come up with, your own version of what makes sense. And then people are sharing that. And as you're saying, they're polarizing. So I've just been, for myself, avoiding talking about what I think. Instead, I'm talking about what I feel. Mm-hmm. How do I feel about, not just about the virus, but how do I feel in isolation? How do I feel right now at this time in my life? And I've been encouraging other people to tell me how they feel if they start going into their thinking around it, because when we share our feelings, it softens the polarization, because you can have different thoughts about it, but you can have the same feelings. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You might have two people who are in fear. They both have different ways of interpreting what's going on, but they both feel fear, or they both are having anxiety, or they might both be having, they might find some kind of like a bridge or a middle point around, what I hear a lot of people now talking about, which is like, oh my gosh, I've gained 15 pounds and I've, it's like, I haven't, I haven't had a haircut, or, all the things that we're sort of used to having on our calendar. And those things really sound like things of privilege, but those aspects of daily life also really do ground us, right? They're routines, and they ground us in sort of the knowing that this is how we take care of ourselves, right? And so, I guess that would just be the first thing I would say, is that the narrative changes when it isn't about beliefs. So I've been trying to do that. The other thing I think about is, and this is really the deeper work that I'm doing right now, that is murkier and hard to talk about because it is about the nonverbal narrative. And to me, that's actually the deepest, most profound narrative that's happening, is the one that's beneath the words, the one that is in the realm of the collective, the one that we can feel in the air, that we can feel in our psyche, that's coming through in our dreams, that is really, it's difficult to put it into a story, but it's so there. And I really feel like that voice of the voiceless, the story, it's like the story beyond the story, is really the work that I'm drawn to. And then how do we connect around that? So I've been meeting with people and spending more time having moments of silence and even just being in each other's presence. And I feel like there can be a lot communicated in those times. And then also really identifying who can I really talk to about the deepest parts of myself, and not make pretty my pain or what I'm going through, but to be able to just really be vulnerable, so that I don't get lost in my own, my own single narrative of Camille.
Right. Well, right. And we all have that, right?
Yeah.
And it's dangerous, actually, to think we don't. I did challenge a woman on a social media page, and sort of a spiritual white woman who I could feel was doing a big bypass. Like, her opinion was the only thing that mattered, didn't matter how it might impact others. And I called her out, and she said, I'm past my ego and identity, and I'm sorry you're not. I was like, that was when I knew I had to stop responding, because it would not have been productive for me, because it would have it sent me into a kind of a rage trigger.
That's why I really have such a hard time with that form of communication. I just think, I don't know, I have big concerns about social media. We've had conversations about that. And about how, people can either, on the one hand, people can put sort of like a false life.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
It's like, here's the beautiful
here's
meal,
the glamour,
and here's the beautiful,
here's the perfect, exactly, the sound bites.
Well, it's a selfie culture, and then we can,
and it's also narcissism. It feeds narcissism.
Well, and then there's the what I heard someone call keyboard warriors, which is people duking it out on social media. And I think that because I teach emotional intelligence, and digital communication is one of the first things that I remember really learning in terms of how the brain operates and how the nervous system operates. It sabotages emotional intelligence and respectful communication. So I think it's really important to avoid, especially like on hot issues, right? On stressful, because again, we're just moving into the thinking around it. It's not about the feeling.
I mean, I agree and I disagree. I disagree only on the level of, I think it's an effective form of communication that is kind of a great equalizer. And I think on my deepest level of values, like the way I see the story circle, is ultimately it's egalitarian. And it is a tribal story circle in a way. I'm talking Facebook. I'm talking Instagram. I know it affects the neuroscience, and I've really had to change my own relationship to it. But for people, talk about voice, who would have been voiceless or maybe marginalized in the culture, it does bring diversity into a conversation, and that I like. I mean, I heard that the Arab Spring uprising would have never happened without Twitter. So certain things, because information can travel so fast, can be an organizing tool in terms of big social justice issues. So that part I love about it. I truly do, the connection. And I, of course, agree with you on the neuroscience. I've seen the way it's changed my own brain chemistry, and I've had to walk it back so that there's more consciousness around what I'm posting and how. And I don't, and I avoid a lot of those conversations. It was a thing for me to even walk away from her and not try and prove something, because the soul is, I think, comfortable with dissonance and with not explaining and just expressing and leaving it. I know the part of the ego, it's like, to me, the ego that wants to win a fight, which is very different from, sharing a point. And things can break down very quickly.
Well, and I think that's I wouldn't really call it a blind spot for me, but it's definitely an area of discomfort because I feel like the path that I'm on about being relational is so important to me that sometimes I miss the both and in terms of the benefits of social media. And I know there really are some. So it's good for me to hear that, right? And you have a different experience of it than I do. Just as I was thinking about that, about, how much work you do on Facebook and on social media. And I have networks of people who don't do anything on social media. And they're out there too, but it's a different, it's more email and phone calls and things like that. So it is a both and, isn't it?
Totally.
It's just really about what is our relationship to ourselves around these things in the world today, and how can we try and stay in our medicine and stay in our integrity and stay connected.
In all situations, on and offline, right?
As much as possible.
Yeah. For me, I've learned so much from being on social media in a positive way. And not to make this all about social media. It's just, again, coming back to this narrative, the narrative of a single story. I'm very curious. It's why I started years ago. I decided to do the cancer monologues because I was most scared of anything in my life. I had like a total phobia about getting cancer because I had some trauma from my family. So I wanted to hear those stories. So I like to lean into stories that make me uncomfortable. And I've gotten to go into pockets of people that I otherwise wouldn't have gotten to meet. But because, coming back to this, of a friend of ours was sharing this yesterday. He said somebody shared this with him. I don't know if it was some kind of graph or meme or emailed or whatever, but it was like, there was a circle. It was a triad. It was like the people who think like, this is all a conspiracy. The people who think big pharma just wants to make money off this. The people who think this is the end of the world. The people who think this is the best thing to ever happen to Mother Earth. And then it was like in the tiny circle in the middle, me. And I thought, well, that's powerful. That's this emotional intelligence to me of being willing to stay open to all these narratives and hang more with the mystery. And you and I have been talking a lot about, too, grief. So let's talk about that in terms of only having one narrative or getting really attached to it. What do you think is the role grief plays in that?
Well, I guess first of all, I think grief takes us out of narrative in a way. The prefrontal cortex really shuts down somewhat, not completely, of course, but the brain changes depending on what state of grief we're in, and whether or not we are, have resilience or whether there's trauma. They're all different kinds of grief. But that's a really good question. I don't know that I have any kind of an answer or anything to add to that, except that I think that grief is a state. There are some things that are emotions, and then some things that are states of being, it's like, and I think of grief as being a state of being that we travel through. And we've talked about that a little bit before. But, grief is the big connector because we grieve because we love. Grief, is the other side of love, or grief is the other side of joy. It's the price of admission for loving. And so I think it pulls us into those deep waters where transformation happens, where we have to sort of surrender to it because it's not something that we can just shake off, or it's not something we can take a pill for. And we're called to go into the depth of it,
Yeah, and when you were talking earlier about people's discomfort with just being with the unknown right now,
right,
and the mystery, and how do we hold on to control? To me, the grief state can be a softening around that. Like for me, if I allow myself to actually feel and grieve and feel the terror of the unknown, my human terror of the unknown, and not try and just talk about it and do a spiritual bypass like, yes, of course I have faith, and, call on past experiences of faith, and rather just be with it. And I do feel like that's at the heart of something that isn't named online. And there's no space for that usually online. And maybe it's not even appropriate to bring that there, or maybe it is, or maybe it's in conversations like this. But the avoidance of grief, I think, makes us also grasp on to a single narrative, because a single narrative is a cookie cutter answer. And even if it's not a complete answer, I think it can feel settling to the nervous system to say, well, I'm just going to grab onto this belief.
Yeah, one of the things for me in terms of the single narrative and grief is that grief changes who we are.
Mm-hmm.
We're not the same when we come through the other side of grief. And so our narratives have to change because we change.
Yeah, it feels to me, right. Something gets revealed that is deeper and truer, too. It's the cookie cutter. We're not grasping so much for it then.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are no answers. There are no easy answers when we're in a state of grief. I mean, we're almost sort of forced to surrender to the unknown.
And what's interesting to me in this time is there's individual grief, but there's collective grief in states, in families, in community, in the country, here in the U.S., global grief. There's eco grief, right, around the environment.
Mm-hmm,
there's
a lot.
There are new things emerging, and right. It's a radical time. It's an absolutely, to me, the most radical time in my lifetime.
And there's this really, I've been thinking about this kind of almost this sweet juxtaposition between the grief that I'm feeling among humans,
mm-hmm.
and then the joy that I'm experiencing in nature.
Yes.
I have seen more incredible birds at my house, and more just the animals, even the insects. Everything just feels more alive. The natural world feels to me like it is just celebrating this change.
Waking up.
It's waking up and relieved.
And coming out of its exile, as we feel in our exile, more in some way.
That's exactly right.
They're coming out. I just posted something this morning about these incredible deer. You have to look at it. I mean, it's happening in countries all over the world. And the fact that the smog is down. I asked Sid, my husband, how long it would take for the ice, to stop melting. He said, well, but he had read something on it. If we kept things like this without all the fossil fuels being burned, as many airlines and all, 3 or 4 years, it's a big, right? Like, how are we going to restore the species and how we're relating to the earth? And
yeah, that's the big question: is the human species and the connection to the earth. Are we going to be hospicing humanity, or are we going to be hospicing the planet in a way? I mean, we're not really going to hospice the planet, but the natural world,
Well, are we going to have to hospice the species? I remember many years ago, and when you asked that inquiry, I was sitting at the feet of a guru at the time. And we talked about me sort of getting over the guru culture, but she said something very profound at the time. And she said, hope is as hollow as fear, because both take us out of the moment, of this mystery of the now. We only have it. And even hope. And I've always felt ambiguous about hope since she said that, right? Because maybe I want hope to sort of fight for something or move towards something. But I think hope's been taken away if we're honest right now. And people want to cling to hope in these single narratives.
I think there are different kinds of hope, though. I think there's the superficial hope that like things are going to just get better. I think that there is a way of rediscovering the meaning of hope so that it becomes authentic to the experience that it's being applied to, right? And I think hope is connected to meaning. Viktor Frankl talks a lot about that in Man's Search for Meaning, and he talked about what it was like living in the concentration camps and how he could always tell, when someone was going to die. And he, as a physician, he said it was not about their physical condition. It was about their
state
loss of hope.
Yeah.
Right. And so, he talked about how he would walk and imagine seeing his wife in the sky and in the clouds, and he would come up with these, these little rituals for himself to keep his connection alive. Because I think hope, if hope is external to us, it's superficial and hollow. I agree with her. But if hope is tied to our internal medicine and our meaning about life, then I think it can help us with resilience,
I love that. And I love Viktor Frankl, and I read his book years ago, and it's radical resilience. And I mean, one of the ways I think I do carry hope, or maybe some of us do, is when we're with the unknown, whether it's about our own life and death, anything, the hope is, for me, I think of my daughter. I think of the generation after us. I think of, a friend of mine said this to me before all this crisis started, I don't know, a few years ago, and she said, the world is going to be a beautiful place, and I hope I live to see it, like on the other side of this fall. That was inevitable. It came, whether through having Trump as president or, global fascism or, war or all these things. It was inevitable that a fall come, right? Because we've been on this collision course as a human species for so long. And that entitlement of sort of neoliberalism, we can all have whatever we want when we want it, and it goes past red and blue. It's become this materialistic all of this. And so it was inevitable that in some ways, our personal hope had to shift. I think now, and you talk a lot about the long game.
Well, and I think that, I remember when I interviewed Larry Dossey, I think I've interviewed he and Barbie, his wife, and mentor and dear friend of mine, maybe 3 times. And I remember he was talking about a conversation that he had with Dean Radin, who runs the Noetic Sciences Institute, and that he asked Dean, are you optimistic about the future? And Dean said, I don't have a choice.
Yeah.
And Larry's message about that was, optimism actually is our responsibility. And that reminds me of what it's like to be a mother and a grandmother, for me to become kind of like desperate and indulge myself in ruminating, because ruminating really takes us down into a negative spiral. It's like how it really is this paradox that we're asked to feel the depth of our feelings and to go into our grief, and also to remain optimistic and to exercise some of these tools like gratitude and to practice empathy and to watch how we're starting to shut down or not feel, or we get to be like too interior inside of ourselves. So then it's hard to bring ourselves out. All of those things I think have to do with exile, right? Because we can think of exile in the world as external, but there's also internal exile, and our relationship to ourselves and our own feeling states, I think, is one of the things that I want to work on in my lifetime in terms of relearning human connection, because there's so much emphasis on the outer conditions of the world.
It's so true. And one thing I've learned by doing some family constellation work with you is I always felt exiled. And then I realized I'd exiled myself from my family, like from my lineage. And I was playing it out like I was somehow exiled. It's also taking that, finding a way to change that story, shift that narrative. And taking more ownership to me always about whatever layer of narrative that I'm not seeing. That's the thing. All these narratives are playing out. So what aspect of the narrative am I exiled from? Perhaps willingly, which is different to me from even taking a stance or choosing an opinion or feeling about a narrative. But there can be this unconscious sort of way we exile ourselves. And sometimes exile ourselves from narratives that just make us uncomfortable or they feel so foreign. Anyway.
This has been a great conversation. I love being able to do this on occasion, just having an impromptu, conversation around a topic that one of us chooses. And so it was a creative process for me not to have put any thought into this subject. And it's really great as usual. I think one thing I'd like to maybe just say, and kind of as we're wrapping up here, there's a great emotional intelligence exercise that helps you work with your own thinking and the way that you have, basically working with your narratives. And that is for any situation that you're thinking about, write down at least 6 options. And what happens is that it actually changes the chemistry in the brain. And oftentimes, either one of those options will just clearly be the right thing or a new thing. The brain becomes creative in thinking about solutions or ways of viewing something. It doesn't have to just be about a problem, but it can be about a narrative. You could write down your narrative and then make yourself write down 5 other narratives that are completely different, and some of them completely opposite from your first narrative, which is sort of your go-to. And then oftentimes a new narrative will come out from that kind of creative thinking that you force your brain to come up with those things.
I do that when my clients are trying to find a title. I'll say, write down
really?
30. 30 is my number.
Wow.
But it makes sense to me around 6. I'm like 30 because you're going to think it's this and this and this, right? But the creative process, which you're talking about, it shifts the brain, which is to me why it's so important, right? To stay open to radical creativity and even improvisation. Even these conversations change my thinking. Deep conversations where we don't go in so much with an answer, but like an inquiry, and we're batting the ball back and forth, and maybe we see these things the same and these different, but there's a diversity. I think people talk about diversity. It's a word like hope on the outside, but diversity to me is an inner thing. How diverse can I be in my empathy and my curiosity to as many stories and experiences? Do I also trust myself enough to take in seemingly contradictory experience and not feel the need to lock down and know, but rather to trust myself to work with it, to synthesize it in a way that makes sense to me and allow it to continue to shift and change as I shift and change and grow. There's something really, I think, about self-trust that allows for more narratives.
And having empathy for yourself, right? We think of empathy as being for someone else, but having empathy for yourself. And one way we can do that is to remember that every thought we have was stimulated by a feeling. The feelings come first, and the thoughts come from that, but we don't track the feelings. So for example, if I have a feeling of fear, I'm going to have a thought that's related to that fear. So one of the things we can do when we find ourselves like sort of taking stock or evaluating our thinking and our beliefs is that we can actually say, what are the feelings behind that? What were the feelings that drove that? Because feelings are just information. They're not good or bad, but when we can identify those feelings, it calms the amygdala in the brain and takes us out of fight or flight, reduces the cortisol in the body. So for me, it's really in this left hemisphere dominant culture, Because trust me, I love thinking. I mean, I'm in a Jungian training program that requires me to do a lot of reading and thinking. But I feel like really I know where my work is in this life is for myself. Of course, I'm doing it because I need it, right? It's not just that I'm helping others with it, but really bringing it back to the body. How does it feel in the body? And what are the emotions behind it? And what does that tell me about myself?
It's interesting. It's a very different process, I think, from mine, and it's part of my process. For me, I'm only thinking about this because you stated yours. I'm like, well, what will mine be? I'm like, mine is like full liberation, to give myself permission to speak and think and feel exactly what's arising in the moment, and then permission to shift with it publicly. To be intimate with the world is my greatest interest. It doesn't always create harmony, but I'm interested in having an intimate, ongoing revelation of myself and revelation of others back to me. And I continue to learn the most often, and I only realized this recently, by relationships that allow for dissonance with me, allow for conflict. There's almost something in that for me. It's almost like I'm trying to experience some kind of mastery around freedom and conflict without it ending a relationship, but rather it deepening it. And I feel that way sometimes with individuals, but also with the world.
It's so interesting that you just said that, because I had never thought about that between you and I, which is that like your muse is the outer world. My muse is the inner world. And that is interesting, because you and I are really doing radical work.
Yes.
Both of us in the world. But my stage is inside and your stage is outside. And then we flip it. So we're both, and then I take it out into the world.
Yes. And we do flip it. And I take it deep inside and into a very intimate, private place too. Yeah.
Yeah. That's just that the way it's almost like our order is a little bit different.
Yeah.
That's great.
It is.
Well, I'm grateful that you have the intention set to be able to have dissonance in relationship, because we really need that in the world. There's, as we've said before in other podcasts, that's dissonance really is the heart of creativity and beauty. Right?
And it unlocks intimacy, actually.
Yes. Yes, it does unlock intimacy, to have the safety for everything to belong.
Totally. I mean, my husband often says that to me. He's like, I'm letting some anger out, like, come back later, like I never have before. And he says, but I was never safe enough. No one could hold that and still love me.
That's beautiful. That's a great place to end.
All right. Thanks for jumping in the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. That was a great subject. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining Camille and Tanya for this episode of Restoring the Culture. If you were inspired, we would deeply appreciate it if you would leave a review on iTunes or any other platform where you heard our podcast. For more ongoing inspiration and support, please join our no-cost global Facebook community, Restoring the Culture. You can support our podcast by making a donation here. And remember, we are each restoring the culture as we restory our own lives. See you next time.